It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's debate on corporate governance, a booster for innovation. My name is Michael Hill. I'm a board member of ecoDa, and I'm very pleased to moderate today's debate. When we talk about innovation and corporate governance, I think there are two challenges we usually have to overcome in a European context in particular. First of all, corporate governance, which is very often tailored toward risk avoidance and compliance, should not be a hindrance, but actually an enabler of innovation. And secondly, in a European context, we should ask ourselves, how can corporate governance help overcome what McKinsey in a recent study dubbed the technology gap of European companies versus American and to a certain extent as well, Chinese companies? Now, these two lead questions also guided the process of compiling the corporate governance dialogue, the white paper from ecoDa on this topic, which we'll introduce in a minute. But before that, let me introduce our distinguished panel today, who will debate this fascinating topic of corporate governance innovation. A very warm welcome to Abigail Levron. She's a professor and also director of research of Goberno, the Belgian Association of Corporate Directors. Then we have Annalisa Gigante, a former head of innovation of a very large multinational, Holcim, and now a corporate director in multiple companies. Then Chris Hodge, he's a senior advisor to the UK Institute of Directors. And finally, Gatis Kokins, board member of various companies in the Baltics. And what I really liked when I checked out his profile before this debate, he calls himself an advocate for good corporate governance. Now, before we start our debate, I'm very happy to hand over to Abigail, who led the efforts to compile the 22 Corporate Governance Dialogue, to give us a brief introduction on this very important white paper on corporate governance, innovation, and Europe. Abigail.
Thank you, Michael. And indeed, as the lead of, or in my capacity as the lead of the Corporate Governance Dialogue, I also would like to warmly welcome you to this very interesting webinar on a very challenging topic as well. The Corporate Governance Dialogue is in fact a platform under the auspices of ecoDa. And within the dialogue, we reflect on the future evolution of corporate governance, as well as on governance trends and challenges that our directors are facing. The dialogue would really like to identify and, as I said, discuss the next topical issues in corporate governance and to create awareness among boards in Europe regarding the new emergent topics. It is established as an open forum, so we get input from the business world, we get input from the academic community, input from directors, managers, and shareholders. So a lot of stakeholders are involved. And concerned with European competitiveness, we have been tackling actually just the issue of innovation, and we also wanted to stimulate board members to transform their business towards a more sustainable future. So that's why we have tried to identify the boosters for innovation, and we based ourselves on the research that has been done in this respect and complemented that with different interviews that also the staff of ecoDa has performed. We have identified 5 major boosters, namely digitalization, business ecosystems and platforms, the access to quality information, also the need for more innovation enhancing regulation, and finally the topic of ESG as sustainability. I just want to stress that we don't tackle the question of innovation for the sake of it, but it's really important to have strategic innovation that brings value for society at large. Put differently, innovation must be a source of progress for society, enhancing health and quality of life. So we've bundled these different topics, and thanks to different authors, into the white paper. The white paper that was just showed on the slide that you can download and have a reading after the seminar is actually a warning call and a call for action. A warning call because as Michael just mentioned, Europe is really lagging behind on innovation, on the topic of technology. So there is also a call for action, both for policymakers and the board of directors as such. It is very important to, and we will tackle that during the debate, but for both, it will be mainly a call for action to have a change in mindset and to stimulate a culture of innovation. But it's not only a call for action towards large listed companies, because in Europe, SMEs is really at the heart of our economic landscape. So the SMEs are also affected directly or indirectly. What regulations or policymakers are doing or are part of the value chain of large listed companies. They cannot be left out, and they also need sufficient support to transform themselves. So Michael, I reach back to you or hand over back to you, because that was actually the introduction that I would like to make from the corporate governance dialogue.
Thanks a lot, Abby. And I think what we try to achieve now in this next 53 minutes, it's really to complement what was written in this report and take up some of the ideas. And we'll try to do it in 3 steps. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what's on a high level, the relation between corporate governance and innovation, what are some of the obstacles, but also how you can combine it in an effective way. We'll then turn the light on the policymakers. So what do we as board members believe policymakers could do, should do, to make Europe the home of innovative companies and boost this very important value driver. And finally, we're going to turn to ourselves, talk from our perspective as board members, what can we do? How can we make the boards more innovation friendly and a real booster for innovation? So probably let's start with you, Chris. I know you're currently working on a study with the IUD on exactly this topic, innovation in corporate governance. What has been your main findings so far, how to relate these 2 concepts?
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be part of this panel. As Michael just said, by accident and also I think by a bit of design, the Institute of Directors in the UK has been doing a sort of parallel study to that's been done by ecoDa, which resulted in the white paper, and obviously there's a lot of overlap between the 2, given the subject matter. Our report is still being prepared and will be published before the end of the year. And although it's a UK-specific report, it was being undertaken for very similar reasons to the ones that Michael and Abigail have just talked about. Partly, we see innovation as key to meeting the challenge of sustainability for companies if they are to meet some of those challenges. But also the UK has a poor track record, or at best a mixed track record when it comes to innovation, and against many of the indicators lags behind continental Europe in the same way as Europe as a whole lags behind the US and other markets. We have some very highly innovative sectors and companies, but we also have a long tail of companies that innovate very little, even in terms of their own internal processes. So that was the rationale for this. We followed a similar process in terms of doing this, as Abigail's described for their white paper, and I noticed, looking at the list of participants, a couple of names of people who I've spoken to who've been very helpful during the course of that. So thank you to you, and good to see you here. We started earlier in the year with a discussion paper which asked for comments on 4 pillars that we felt were relevant to understanding governance and innovation. 3 of which you've already mentioned in terms of your description, Michael, of what we're going to talk about today, which are the role and composition of the board, organizational structure of the company, the role of regulators and policymakers, and the impact of the ownership structure on the company and its approach to innovation. I won't say anything now about the first 3 of those, as we'll be picking them up later, other than to say that what's come through very strongly when talking to board members of both large companies and startups and SMEs is that the 2 keys to successful innovation within the company is to integrate it into the company's strategy and purpose, and then to create an innovative culture. And that's obviously something that the board does, but it's relevant at all levels of the organisation. And while that's primarily down to the company, the actions of regulators and owners can either help or hinder that to a great extent. On ownership in particular, what in the UK, the debate traditionally has tended to be focused on listed companies, the concerns about some shareholders supposedly having a short-term view and prioritising getting dividends over investment and R&D and so on. And we've heard some of that again, and there is, I think personally, it's sometimes overstated, but there is some truth in that. But what we've been hearing in talking to other companies who are private, of varying sizes, including startups, is that this isn't just an issue in the listed sector, at least not in the UK. And the absence of what you might call patient capital is quite a big issue for many companies with a private equity or a venture capital ownership. The other issue that's perhaps linked to that, that's coming through quite a bit, is if, except in the cases of entrepreneurs or where the owners are, are the owners and the creators, if you like, the entrepreneurs are the same people, is when looking for new capital, is whether other investors actually understand the business case for innovation and the business model of the company. And if not, that affects their willingness to invest. And that's something that certainly I think has been, my experience has been a bit of a recurring problem, certainly in the UK for many years. Those of us old enough to remember the nanotech boom, which goes back about 20 years now. There were a lot of great startups in the UK, but they were all bought up by US funds in the early 2000s because there were no UK investors who understood the technology or the potential impact of that technology who were willing to put any money in. So, and I think we've seen that pattern repeated in further technology booms in the UK since. Again, it's not just a matter of external capital. This is my sort of last introductory point. Certainly here we sometimes see a lack of investment in family or in other companies with a controlling owner that might be caused to, for example, a resistance to change in the case of some family businesses, depending on which generation of the family is still at the top of the company. State ownership in the UK is not a big factor that much, but from what I know from other markets, I think there's something Gatis may want to talk about, is that again can have a great impact on the board's understanding of innovation and its willingness to invest in innovation. So I'll finish there.
Thanks for really highlighting this very important relationship between ownership and innovation. I think, and you just already highlighted, I think Gatis, you are on the board of many companies, and some of them are also kind of state-owned or state-influenced. What would be your observation on how much this influences the way boards do or should manage innovation?
Right. I think when we are talking about key innovation themes, we also have to admit that there are quite a lot of businesses which actually need to change legacy business models completely, and somehow many of them used to be state monopolies and are still owned or majority or minority by the state, which adds additional complexity to the issue. So there are some big corporates which business models are basically from 20th century or even before. For instance, fixed telecoms, fossil energy, railroad transportation, also banking, which enjoys software from 60s. And I've spent more than 10 years in telecom, and that was quite an experience because our kind of fixed voice business went down from 85% in our business portfolio to like 8%. So and you have then choice, either you wind down the company or you innovate and you find a new business instead of that old business model. And then obviously board has quite this big challenge because sometimes there are no next big thing you could put instead of that declining business. This is quite hard journey from predictability to kind of agile environment. You have to change your business culture from ordinary regulated kind of trusted, predictable towards agile, fail fast, and the situation where you actually have to have break even in quite a short term. Then you certainly realize that this KPI approach that you kind of construct KPIs for the board and then control for the management and control them doesn't work anymore. But still you have some privilege being legacy business. You have quite a good market share, you have a customer base, and it really depends on your ability to innovate, whether you will lose it, will give it to startups, which are in many cases more efficient, or you still will be able to transform your business. And then obviously for government, it's state-owned enterprises. It's a big issue because if in the very beginning they were able to work on fiscal goals, then moving towards non-fiscal, whether it should include innovation or not, it should be kind of political or even today military targets for business, and how that will probably ruin the value of the company and what to do with this. So I think that need for innovation really generates a lot of challenges, and I think directors must be really smart to address it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gatis, for adding, I think, two more components. Number one, I think, talking about business model innovation. So innovation is not just technology driven, but it can be a business model, and that's usually probably even harder, to implement. And secondly, the complexity when you have kind of state-owned or state-influenced, which again is a very different game you're playing. And this probably leads me to a very, basic question. Taking a step back, probably, Annalisa, actually, what is innovation, or how could you best define it? And because you have worked as a head of innovation, so I'm sure you have your own definition, and now you interacting with the management on innovation topic in the board. So how would you define it?
So it's absolutely right that the word innovation is used in a really wide variety of areas, but actually those of us who work there have a very tight definition of what it means. Innovation is all about outcomes. It's about new sales, new things that are on the market and are successful in the market. And in that sense, it's exactly what Gatis said. It can be a product, a service, a business model. It can be a variety of different things, but it's all to do with new sales and new products and finding really large market opportunities where we can solve interesting problems. So in that sense, it's very different from R&D, whereas in research, we really focus on trying to understand how things are. And the KPI probably for R&D is published papers. And the KPI for development is something like IP, how many patents you have. The KPI for innovation is extra sales, extra EBIT, and extra market cap. The most important thing also to understand is that innovation is its own discipline. So, a while ago, we were just trying all sorts of different things, but now we really understand what makes innovation work and how that handles the issue that Chris was talking about earlier about risk appetite. So one of the examples of that is that when we look at different projects that we want to fund, we look at it as a portfolio. And so we can adjust the risk of that portfolio. We should have some projects that are shorter to market, more incremental, more easier to get to. We understand where we're going, but we also have to have projects that are really pushing the boat out and really answering the problems that we have today in society. And it's that average portfolio, for example, is one of the techniques we use in innovation to manage some of the issues that come up at boards.
Okay, great. Now, thanks a lot for also kind of highlighting this difference between outcome and output. I think that's something, again, we'll I'm sure we'll take up when we talk about, the implication of policymakers. Do they really understand it, and are they able to influence not just outputs but as well outcomes? I think a very important topic to take up again. Before we get there, probably let's turn to Abigail. I think you wrote a very interesting piece in the white paper on the meaning relevance of ecosystem for innovation. Can you briefly elaborate on your findings on that topic?
Yes, indeed, Michael. And I just heard you saying it, innovation is not only about technology, but technology is a very important, I say, enabler, because if you look at the list of the top of the most innovative companies in the world, we see that actually their success can be attributed to the emergence of the interconnected digital technologies and the way they artificial intelligence platforms and ecosystems really support this company in their innovation efforts. At the same time, we also see that due to the changing and growing customer demands, asking more and more for a higher user experience, but at the same time, the huge societal challenges that needs to be tackled. I think about the health, the global warming, water shortage, energy concerns, and the poverty. Companies are also aware that they cannot tackle these challenges all by themselves and stay isolated. So you see the emergence of new forms of partnerships. And that is really also giving some new challenges from a governance perspective, because you see great diversity in these ecosystems of partnerships. You see also partnerships or ecosystems that are quite successful while others are less successful. So the relative power of each player in the system is becoming more prominent. And from a governance perspective, it is really challenging to safeguard this common purpose also in this wider ecosystems. And actually a very old issue in corporate governance is how to manage the conflicts of interest that might arise. And we also talked about already the startup and the scale up. You see also that the integration of younger generations, they think completely different and on these management methods and more collaborative approach and that you see these startup communities more frequently arising with new challenges. One of these I say quotes that I liked from a former CEO that was part of this kind of new ecosystem is that the challenge is to find your right spot in these ecosystems, a spot where nobody is going to be better than you and you can't be made redundant. So there is quite some work to do to get some the perspective far more from internal external stakeholders within this kind of new forms that are definitely able to create societal value compared to the more traditional business forms.
Okay, very interesting. I'm sure we get back as well to how this influences the board, when you are engaged in ecosystems and partnerships, which I think it's another challenge, but I really like your notion. I think moving away from looking for the white to the right spots. And I think that's definitely an interesting task for boards to fulfill. And you mentioned just before, ecosystems, or why we see the rise of ecosystems is exactly because many challenges we might not be able to solve ourselves as companies or even as governments. And this definitely opens up the perspective, what's the role of policymakers? Should they help coordinate and even build ecosystems, in particular when it comes to the topic of sustainability, or should it rather take a more passive approach? Probably, Annalisa, you have seen both sides. What is your perspective? What actually should governments, what role should it play when it comes in particular to sustainability and innovation?
Well, so I look at things in terms of where the opportunities really are. And today, when I look at investments in innovation projects, I don't see a difference between an innovation bucket and a sustainability bucket. For me, they are one thing. The policy environment can help to de-risk some early technologies. I think just understanding how fast we need to implement new sustainable solutions to manage the issues that we have today is important. And so the policymakers can have that in mind to help us move faster and de-risk in the early stages.
Okay, interesting. And probably, Chris, you mentioned before, about one of the pillars being regulation in your kind of study. And I'm sure you looked at both sides of the coin, having too much or too little regulation. What are your findings? What actually, is helpful for innovation?
Thanks, Michael. I mean, it will come as a surprise to nobody that if you interview a large number of company directors, mostly it's negative, what we've been hearing. Not so much about specific pieces of regulation, and some of which are like UK specific anyway. So, but it's more about the cumulative impact of regulation on the board in two respects. I think one is the amount of time that boards spend on compliance at the expense of other things that are perhaps more important for the business, like strategy and innovation and so on. But the other is how directors interpret their legal duties, because a lot of the regulation that's written, a lot of the codes that are in place are designed with very good policy objectives, such as consumer protection or whatever they may be. But the impact collectively of that is they tend to make boards more risk averse in the way they think about their decisions and what activities they undertake. And then that in turn, I think, has a sort of knock-on effect that the sort of people who you look for to sit on the board may come from the sort of background or have the expertise that means they are naturally risk averse anyway. So it's a sort of unhealthy accumulation of that. And I think that's one of the things that we'll be highlighting in the report, and one of the things we can perhaps talk about and when we get to talking about the board is how you counter that in terms of board composition. We have also been looking for ways in which policymakers and regulators in particular can play a positive role. Annalise talked about a lot of the broader policy framework in terms of skills and support. The one suggestion that we've had, which I see is also in the ecoDa white paper, so it must be a good idea, is that when regulators and policymakers carry out assessments of new proposals, they certainly in the UK there's a legal requirement for them to carry out what's called regulatory impact assessments, and that there should be, the suggestion is that there should be some assessment of the impact on innovation as part of that, and that has challenges, not least the defining of it, as Annalise said in your earlier remarks. But we've also been looking at the example of the UK financial services regulator, who has developed what they call a fintech sandboxes, which, and again, this is something that's recommended in the white paper. And it's not my area of expertise, but essentially what happens is that companies that have innovative proposals, including often very small companies, can go to the regulator. They will be given a limited, assuming they pass various criteria, will be given a limited period, an authorization period, where they can develop ideas with support and guidance from the regulator and test them out in the market. And if they're then satisfied that there are no ill effects of that, then they're sort of fast tracked for full authorization, which makes the cost of entering the market can be a significant improvement on that. So I think that's an interesting idea that's worth exploring in other sectors as well. It probably works better where you're a regulated industry and you have a regulator that has both the resource and the expertise to provide that sort of support, which may not be the case for a lot of companies. But that's again something we'll want to look at further in our own report, I think.
So meaning you also need innovative regulation or policy-making process as well to deal with innovation.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they need the capacity to be able to do that in the same way as companies do, which is often the challenge, I think. So.
And that's probably a good, a point for Abigail. You live in Brussels, very close to the European Union kind of, administration. And so, what are your observations and on the role between regulators, policymakers, and corporate boards?
Well, I suppose I'm I can speak for a lot of companies that to be aligned with what Chris is saying, that there is a little bit too much regulation, and if we speak to board members, that indeed there is at least for some sectors a lot of time going towards compliance and how to say, managing the risk rather than being having the time to really focus on entrepreneurship and innovation. And that is what the governance framework actually has been stimulating, if we can say so, because if you look at the evolution in the regulatory framework and also in the governance framework, you see that a lot of measures and regulation was there to protect value. We've seen a lot of scandals, we've seen a lot of abuses, and all the measures has been there to actually protect the value being destroyed rather than stimulating value creation by means of innovation and entrepreneurship. So in this respect, there is a clear plea also from ecoDa, is to have really a regulatory framework that stimulates innovation rather than how we say, stimulate a box-ticking compliance exercise. And it is in this respect of utmost importance to also have a clear level playing field and to allow for multitude of governance regimes to exist, because a one-size-fits-all approach is not favorable for all types of companies and suitable, because there are different companies or different sizes, different culture, different context in which they flourish. Different business models, and then the startup is a completely different entity than an assurance company or listed company. And also not only a flexible framework, but also a clear regulatory framework, because if you see the different regulations popping up, there is how we say, an opportunity for loopholes. There are different interpretations, even among lawyers. They have different meanings of the regulatory framework. So that should be definitely that could be better done, and in this respect. And also, indeed, like Chris said, stimulate and the sandbox, regulatory sandbox. We also plead for perhaps reliance on more national corporate governance codes instead of regulation, because codes are more flexible to adapt according to the circumstances. But perhaps the European Commission should also rely on data-driven regulatory intervention and use also the technology of the different sources of data that is available to be more enlightened with signals or clues of what is really working if the regulation is there, and what should be better or could be better, and use the data that is available, technology to analyze that impact of the regulation.
I think also, as Ali said, and you just reiterate, I think there's a lot of knowledge around and experience how to innovate, and I think it should be taken seriously, into regulation to really be effective. So that is, you from a board member perspective, what would be on your wish list to the government? What can they do, should they do to help your companies become more innovative?
Sure. So I view this policy making as a probably wider process rather than only regulation. And here I completely support Abigail's worries that we should not over-regulate, we should not put too much emphasis on risk compliance, and I believe most of boards are mature enough to tackle those issues by themselves. On the other hand, policymakers can do a lot, for instance, in public education and training. I think that's an area where we can have a lot of improvement. For instance, in many markets, the limitation of innovation is actually lack of students which are trained in science, technology, IT. it comes actually back to probably secondary school or high school, where there are not enough people who do STEM education. So obviously there is kind of competition from humanitarian specialties, but for technological innovation, we need those new talents coming to the market. And then we should talk also about universities themselves. There is so-called Humboldt University approach, where actually universities, both educational and science research, and in our case also business-linked entity. And we have a lot of possibilities for policy making to improve that kind of integration between science, technology, business, and education. And then again, on the positive side, what policymakers can do better. So we have those diversity requirements, but probably there should be also innovation requirements, some clever and smart digitalization requirements, some common standards could also improve our ability, our EU market fragmentation, which is in this McKinsey report, and also this ecoDa white paper mentioned as a weak aspect of European Union. I think that could help a lot. And then obviously there is big tech domination from predominantly US companies, which are actually creating ecosystems which are closed to new entrants. And then again, here European regulators can do a lot to provide access and to provide fair taxation and to create competition in that area as well. Otherwise, US companies dominate, and that actually prevents progress.
Thanks a lot, Kadis. I think a very good point you make about, kind of really building the fundamentals of innovation, which is education, our talents. And then I think the other point you mentioned in the end, yes, I think we see the European Union doing quite a lot when it comes to protect the markets against some of the American tech companies. I think probably needs both approaches to help companies provide the right conditions. Now, let's return the perspective away from what others can do and the regulators should do to ourselves, to the board members. So what have been your experience? How can we as board members help companies become more innovative? And here I would like to turn to Annalisa again, because you have really seen all sides of the story. You also work with universities as well, or in boards of research institutes as well. So what would be your key takeaways, recommendations, what board members can and should do to really become a booster of innovation?
So there are three really practical things we can do as board members to help the companies that we serve be more innovative. The first one is understanding how we define risk. If we only look at the pessimistic side of risk, we will end up doing the minimum, and that will erode our margins. Risk is a positive thing. Not innovating is actually far riskier than innovating. And so that definition of risk and how we decide based on the risk appetite for a company is very important to have. The second point is how we make decisions on capital allocation. Again, something very, very practical. At the very end of the day, it is the decision of what we do with the extra cash we have that impacts whether we're innovative or not. For example, how much of that capital is allocated to a share buyback versus how much is then allocated to research, development, or innovation. And that is about our belief on how much the company's market cap can grow. So if we don't believe that it can grow by investing in ourselves further, that's kind of an interesting discussion to have at the board. And finally, again, we discussed it earlier, but skills are really critical. Whether you like it or not, every company today is a tech company. whether it's just IT or materials or services or business models. Every company is a tech company. And then you really have to look at your skill matrix and understand that you have people in your team that understand how this works and help make the right decisions for the company.
Well, Elizabeth, just to build on your point, so how would you help or recommend, what should boards do to actually transform to such a company which you just described? You know, if you're not yet have this risk perspective, not yet feel like being a tech company, what are some of the recommendations you would give to board members how to help the company make this transformation?
So the best recommendation I can give you is hang out a bit with a VC or with a startup incubator. Just get to know how it feels like being part of that. You will come back making decisions much faster, understanding what is critical and what isn't. And there's nothing like experiencing that to really help change what becomes important and how you then support the company. And it doesn't matter how large the company is. I think everybody can do with a speed up. And if you don't know how it feels like, it's very difficult to really pioneer it inside the board team. Okay, you recommend the board should a little bit unlearn and learn again, kind of this different mindset. Okay, very interesting. Gadi, it's probably back to you and you know your experience working as a board member, but also working with management on these innovation topics. What are your kind of recommendations you can share with us? You're on mute, Gadi.
So my experience with management is quite different. I think I have experienced both extremes. So and I believe that good board must have a good methodology tackling different management teams. For instance, you may have passionate innovators, and then on the other extreme, you have those prudent developers who are afraid of everything changing, etc. And you have to manage that bunch of people. And with innovators, obviously, they are bringing you every month new projects and new ideas, and then you start working on priorities. You start putting some KPIs on R&D expenses and capex. You actually try to force them fail fast, and if they are so innovative, usually there is a lot of projects and many of them are not as good. Then you always talk about the core business, where such a company should stick around, not to be too much diverse and lose probably focus. And then obviously you talk about profitability, because then if you are too innovative, you could walk away from real returns. Then if you have those prudent developers, then obviously you somehow have to facilitate this innovation, and you put a lot of emphasis on strategy sessions. You try to put what now new buzzword is CINO, or Chief Innovating Officer, in the management team. You perhaps establish, besides all those REMCOMs and risk committees, you also establish some technology committee. You try to inspire the team. You actually work on diversity. You look at the average age, and there is also a question from Rocco, how the board diversity could actually improve innovation potential. I would say it's one of them musts. And then working with those who are kind of resisting innovation, one of good ways is actually to start putting KPIs which are not achievable by organic growth of kind of legacy technology or legacy business, and then there is kind of pressure to innovate more. And then obviously you have to leave some budget to fail, because if you put all the investments requiring returns, you will never reach the point where the management is ready to innovate. And at the end, you need also kind of innovating spirit in the board itself. So board composition, both from diversity and innovation perspective, is important. Then the second part is to find a balance between the fact that usually management motivation is kind of short term. Many companies live in that quarterly capitalism reporting to the stock exchange, and technically management usually is very short term oriented, and innovation usually is a process which it's much longer than a quarter. So you have to create kind of long term incentives to solve that issue. And last, I would like to discuss is that innovation is actually a global exercise. It's first of all, again, you need this global thinking already in the board. You must understand if company is competitive globally, then it will be super strong in local markets. You will learn that economies of scale really work. And if there are global challenges, it's very good for company to learn them fast. Then when you look for innovative talents, you will certainly find that you must go for global search. And that also means you probably have to switch to English in your board meetings and documents. So global is also equal to innovative, I would say. So that's from my side.
So if I listen to you, you're really saying what it really needs to be innovative, you have to rethink how you work as a board as well, not just to have the right strategy and policies, but you have to rethink your approach to governance. Such very interesting. So Abigail, you're a board member and a professor. So I think the obvious question to you: what's the relevance of training and evaluation to the success of innovation at the board level?
I definitely want to say something about that, but I first, Michael, want to stress indeed the importance of what has been said by Annelies and Gedis. As a board member, I think it's very, very crucial to be open to new perspectives. And these perspectives can brought into your working from different with different methods. Annelies talked about if I go around and talk with VCs or be in a startup, I think also including the new generations, the next generations. You've seen already the practice of what is called the shadow boards. I don't like the word shadow boards, but indeed being open to new generation, they're different. They have really different mindset and perspectives on the more older board members, older in terms of experience and well-seasoned board members. I think also for boards, it's becoming crucial to really understand the digital transformation. It's not only about the technical knowledge about of technology as such, but what does it mean a digital transformation that every company needs. And like Annelies said, every company is now a tech company, and we, as a board member, we really need to understand what this is really about, and that the technology is a means and not an end in itself. The long-term thinking also, I think a lot of board members need to make now decisions where you on innovation or transformation, that actually the effects will be seen in 10, 15 years when most of the board members will not be there anymore on the board. So it's very hard as a human to have really that long-term vision and make decisions that are not, you're not will be part of it anymore. And for me, there are two tools actually, and then I come to your point, Michael, is board training and the board evaluation are really effective tools to make a diagnose. Where are we in this in the spectrum of the knowledge and the expertise and the competences that we need, the role that we are, the responsibilities and the role that we are taking up regarding the steering of our management, either putting our feet on the gas or rather the brakes that some management needs. And I think these are two tools that are very effective in practice as well.
There was just one question, coming from the audience, from Helena. She asked, what's the relevance of innovation systems like the ones proposed by ISO, for instance, where you really try to bring a structure of innovation in the company. I'm not sure, Abigail, do you have any perspective on that, whether this can be useful or even counterproductive?
In my limited experience, I've seen that the ISO system was very effective because it is a non-listed family business, because it helps us to professionalize the process and to really have like a quality label, to put really the process that is needed. Was in this respect a positive experience. It's a lot of work, also for the team, for the management to get this ISO certification. But for us, in our case, it was very helpful.
And it definitely helps to create awareness for the topic if you kind of go through such a process. Yeah. So, Chris, we have heard a lot of kind of recommendations what the board should do. Anything to add from your perspective?
Well, a lot of the points I would have made have already been covered, and I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said. Just pick out perhaps 3 or 4 things. So, to reinforce what's been said about diversity, I mentioned in my earlier comments about the tendency to have certainly in the UK, to have a sort of risk-averse mindset, and the need to balance that with more creative thinkers, which I think is one aspect of diversity alongside things like gender and ethnicity and age. Part of what we've done for our project is we reviewed all the public reporting of 50 UK companies who have a reputation for good innovation. And we looked at various features of governance to see whether we could find any trends. You won't be surprised to hear that there's nothing that they all do, so it's not as easy as that, unfortunately. But what we did notice is that most of their boards were more diverse in terms of gender, ethnicity, nationality than your average UK board, whether for a listed company, unlisted, or whatever it may be. So I think to reinforce what's already been said, it's diversity in all its forms is a must, not a nice to have if you want to promote innovation. I won't say anything about board's relations with management. I think nothing to add really to what Gatis said. KPIs, I think, and Lisa touched on these, are particularly important, not just for innovation products or services or innovation performance, but also I think for creating the innovation culture, the mindset throughout the organisation that I mentioned earlier, and how you create what we've been heard is described as the permission to fail. People shouldn't feel unwilling to bring forward ideas to try them out for fear of being judged or held back. So I think the whole area of rewards and incentives, which again Gatis touched on, is an area that needs to be looked at, and how you can encourage that without setting unintended incentivizing bad behavior, which is always one of the things there. Final 2 comments which are sort of related. One is about, and links back to something that I think it was Abigail said about the importance of collaboration. And again, that's something that's come through strongly with our study, not just collaboration between the company and the research base or other companies, but also within the company. And it goes back to this idea that Annalisa's we should talk about the definition of innovation. Is the technology or the idea is not the innovation. It's what you do with it that is the innovation. And I think a lot of the companies we've spoken to have said the challenge has been how you structure the organization to support the innovation so that it doesn't either get put off in a silo somewhere or ignored or integrated into the mainstream, and then it appears at number 23 on the management's list of priorities that year. So I think that's a big issue. And to finish, because I think this has helped me frame something I want to be trying to get my head around for my own report. So thank you, Annalisa, for when you said that you should go and hang out with startups and innovators. It seems to me that what we've been hearing from the small companies and startups that we've been talking to and the large listed companies is that the relationship between governance and innovation is different for the two of them. In the case of the startups, governance is to put a framework and structure around the idea or the technology to turn it into a product or a service and get it to market. Whereas in the larger companies, it's much more about trying to help them recreate that sort of startup feel, enthusiasm, entrepreneurialism that's got lost in the giant bureaucracy that the company has become. So I think that's sort of, it's important whatever your size is, but the reason it's important perhaps is slightly different depending on your size and your sector. And I live very close to the so-called Hoxton hub in London, where there's a lot of startups. So as soon as this finishes, I'm going to get my skate and head straight down there and hang out with the kids. So.
But Chris, please don't forget to write a report, because we all eagerly await your report. So excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. I think, as you have seen, I think it's a topic which is definitely which is complex. That's very fair to say, but I think also very fascinating. I think, as you all showed, I think it needs a lot of passion, it needs a lot of determination, and probably a rethink of how we do business. And I think we started with two key challenges of corporate governance innovation. And I think we gained a lot of new perspectives in this 1 hour, on how to deal with those challenges. There's definitely not the one, single solution, but I think there are a lot of different small steps we can take as board members. Hopefully regulators and policymakers will have listened today as well and will incorporate these insights into their rules and regulations. And, but at the end, I think it starts with us to really change the way we do our business and become effective board members. I really would like to thank all of you, Abigail, Annalise, Chris, Gatis, for your excellent contributions and being, so forwarding with your insights. I would like to thank Beatrice and Mano for organizing this event. And as Abigail mentioned at the beginning, feel free to download the report, and you will get another, 10 perspectives on this topic, complementing what we discussed today. I really can recommend the report. I think a good read for you, but probably also your fellow board members. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you for your time, your attention, and I wish you all the best to turn new boards into a real booster for innovation. Thank you.